Welcome to the CanMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amirault. I'm the marketing manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CanMed conference. I hope that all of you will join us this spring for 3 full days of world-class cannabis education at CanMed 2022 in Pasadena, California. It all starts on May 3rd with our full-day medical practicum, led by Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, Dr. Dustin Sulak, Dr. Kevin Spellman, and Eloise Thiessen, NP. Each of them will share the latest medical cannabis research, including information on dosing, drug interactions, and different product types. They will also share the clinical experience they have acquired treating patients with medical cannabis. This really is a must-attend event for any healthcare professionals who are interested in recommending medical cannabis, but it's not limited to those folks. Anyone who is interested in learning more about medical cannabis can and should join us for this event. Head over to canmedevents.com/practicum to learn more. That brings us to May 4th and 5th, the main event, CanMed 2022. 2 full days of oral presentations, panel discussions, poster presentations, and industry exhibitors covering the latest advancements in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. We are really excited about this year's program. It might be our best yet. Just look at our keynote presenters. We have Dr. Ethan Russo presenting cannabis and psychiatry, Dr. Seth Crawford talking about innovations in hemp breeding, Grace Bandong will talk about building a comprehensive analytical testing program, and Dr. Bonnie Goldstein will discuss cannabis medicine for children. Those presentations alone are worth the price of admission, but please go to canmedevents.com to see the full schedule. And if you want a preview of what you can expect at CanMed 2022, check out the CanMed Archive, which is a searchable video library of all the past CanMed presentations and panels. You can find that at canmedevents.com as well, and there is a link in the show description. This episode, we welcome back Afia to talk about the push to standardize cannabis testing labs in California. In late November, the California Department of Cannabis Control issued a statement that they are planning to standardize operating procedures and methods for California cannabis labs by January 2023. This announcement got mixed reaction. On the one hand, consumers and producers have expressed frustration with inconsistencies in lab results, so they welcome the idea. However, many laboratory professionals were quick to point out that standardization is easier said than done, especially because the state didn't offer much insight into what exactly the DCC would standardize or how they would do it. Inni is qualified to speak on this subject because he is the Chief Science Officer at Cannabis, a licensed cannabis testing lab in Southern California. He has also set up multiple labs with best in-class methodology, processes, and technology throughout his career. And at Cannabis, he has led the team towards greater credibility, consistency, and accountability for their clients, regulators, and consumers. During our conversation, we discuss why lab standardization is a good idea, the problem of lab shopping, why some labs intentionally inflate THC values, how natural variations in the cannabis plant can create a range of potency results, how mishandling certified reference materials can throw off lab results, why labs need to be more transparent with their measurement of uncertainty, and whether standardization will stifle lab innovation, which is so important in an emerging industry. Before we get to my conversation with Inni, I would like to thank this episode's sponsor, Cannabis. Cannabis is a California-based cannabis analytical testing lab paving the way in the industry through research, education, and social equity efforts, championing safe and effective cannabis, hemp, and CBD for all, one test at a time. Learn more at csalabs.com. Okay, and without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Afia. Good afternoon, Annie. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Of course, always. All right. So, lab standardization in California. Were you surprised when you saw this news come out in late November, or was it something you knew was coming?
This sort of came as a surprise announcement. I mean, if you looked at the regulations, or I should say SB 544, you knew something should have been coming, but the way it was announced was kind of a surprise.
What was surprising about it?
Well, it just seemed like it was just thrown out there as, oh, here you go. Let's see how people digest this. I felt like there could have been a little more meat to it. It was just sort of, hey, we're going to standardize. And then everybody's like, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So, should have been a
Yeah.
little more meat and potatoes to that.
Right. And so have there been details kind of since then? And I was going to ask you about that because I mean, in the articles that I've read, it's basically that, the DCC is supposed to standardize operating procedures and methods for California cannabis labs by January 2023. Now, have you gotten any sort of indication of whether they are going to involve labs like yourselves kind of in that process in terms of recommending certain instruments or methods or standards? Has there been any more details come out about that?
There hasn't been any formal details that I've seen sort of come out about that. However, I have seen something about the DCC Cannabis Committee being formed, and they were asking for some representative folks to apply to be on that committee. So I suppose those are all connected and headed towards that way. And I've heard some news stories about, state reference labs and whatnot that's underway. So I would assume all this is tied into that. The state recently, I've been sending out emails to labs, trying to get them to standardize the way they report on their COA, specifically how labs are reporting total cannabinoids and some units on the limits of detection and limits of quantification. So I think they're already starting work towards that standardization, and getting the COA to all look the same is probably one way. They're trying to make it easier to quickly read that and folks will understand it.
Okay. And now, do you have any indication? Are they going to actually standardize certain equipment? Like, are labs like yours going to potentially have to purchase new equipment? I know that stuff doesn't come cheap, especially when you're talking about, the instruments used to analyze pesticides and things like that.
Yeah, honestly, if they do it correctly, which again, I'm excited to see how the state plans to execute this, because it's one thing to say it and a secondary thing to execute it. I don't believe that they would ever move to the standardization of equipment or even necessarily a single compendial method, let's say, for instance, an AOAC method or an ASTM method. I do feel that in standardization, they would recommend some things. Let's say we're talking about potency, sort of the way USP does it is if they are um, putting out a compendial method, they refer to a certain column, like a consumable, like a column, they would say USP L1 column to designate like a C18 column, right? They wouldn't necessarily say, oh, the C18 Raptor from Restec or, Agilent or whatnot. So I feel like in some sense, no, it wouldn't necessarily tie you to a certain vendor. Um, it might force some labs to upgrade equipment. Personally, my lab has high level equipment that is able to really meet the demands or whatever sort of regulation might be put out there in terms of limits of detection and whatnot. But for folks who maybe were not thinking ahead of that, yes, they might have to upgrade in order to meet certain limits of detections if those are changed, or even certain, let's say, potency. If they force you to look at the spectra, you may have to get a different detector. If you have a UV vis, you cannot do that, but you may have to go to a diode array detector to look at, the wavelength, several wavelengths of cannabinoids.
Yeah, and you touched on a good point there. Is it on the table that some of the actual requirements or regulations might change as well? Are you going to potentially have to be looking for new pesticides, new microbials, things like that?
I'm really hoping that they will. What is really of concern is the category one pesticides that currently essentially allows the labs to set their own limits of detection. Now, the state does say you have to get to zero point 0.1 microgram per gram, but essentially it allows labs to set as high as that. And others who are perhaps more concerned about consumer safety or perhaps are utilizing the sensitivity of their instruments are validating accordingly and doing the statistical analysis to arrive at a set LODQ based on what they've done with matrix interference and whatnot. But then there are just other labs who may take advantage of that situation and push that limit as far as possible. So it creates this uneven playing ground in the industry where, I'm sure we'll touch on this. It kind of allows for lab shopping based
Right.
on whose LOQ is here, whose LOD is here. If my sample passes the one lab, it's going to fail at the other lab. So, hey, I'm going to go here. And that's what we're trying to avoid, having that sort of uneven playground and just caring more about consumer safety and making it standard. That's where I would assume the state would go after things like that.
Right. So yeah, maybe it's a good point. We should kind of set the table here and talk about the reason why the state's looking to standardize, and that is for the most part to tackle this whole issue of variability between lab results, and which can lead to, as you said, lab shopping. So for people who aren't familiar with that term, maybe you could explain it a bit. And then I'd also like to ask you kind of how pervasive is lab shopping? Is it as common as we hear it is?
Yeah, lab shopping really is around certain manufacturers. I believe there's about 43, I want to say 43 labs in the state currently. I might be wrong on that because new ones are getting added daily.
Right.
But essentially, it's great, right? There's competition, there's options, but because there is no standard way or standard methodology, folks would go out to, I might have a certain flower. Maybe I used a pesticide, maybe I didn't. I'm going to send it out to 5 labs. They're all going to come back, given we're dealing with an agricultural product, they're all going to come back differently. Potency is going to be a little different. Based on limits of detection, my pesticide residue might pass or fail. So as a manufacturer, I'm going to, probably go with the lab that is most likely to pass me based on whatever standards they've set for themselves. And I really think the problem with lab shopping is it's many factors fold issues in many ways. So for one, it does force competition in a detrimental way where all parties lose. I look at it this way. First of all, the consumer loses, right? As a lab may falsify results, leading to higher prices for subpotent products and perhaps even false negative products where a contaminant is being put out there. So consumers are losing in that end. The buyers and the dispensary lose because they're paying more for inflated values if a lab is cheating on potency. The regulators lose because essentially they lose control of that process if they don't have a standardized method. The labs themselves lose, right? As there's a race to the bottom on pricing. We all know inflation is rising, consumables are higher, test costs, unfortunately, seem to go lower. Everything in the world is going higher, but somehow test costs seem to be going lower, which doesn't make sense, right? Competition's great, but they're losing in that way. The employees lose work as a race to the bottom is causing labs to now shut down as they can't remain competitive. They cannot afford to pay employees. Of course, what happens? The taxpayers lose because people go on unemployment increases. It's just a slippery slope. You can see how it really isn't great for anybody to allow this to continue.
Absolutely. And in terms of shopping, is it mostly around potency numbers? Is it around contamination? Is it a little bit of both? Or is there sort of a test that folks are shopping for more than others?
Well, personally, I can tell you that I see it a lot around potency. where folks are sending in samples and you are doing your best to give a high quality controlled result. And folks are saying, hey, well, lab B is giving me 10 points higher on it. So you get a flower in and you're testing at 19, but lab B is testing it at 27, which clearly doesn't make sense. Now, yes, there's arguments around, hey, it's an agricultural product. Is it a top nug? Is it a bottom? Was it outdoor? Was it indoor? There's variances, but those sort of variances are highly unlikely. So, yeah.
Sort of in addition to that, I mean, at least here locally, we're out in Massachusetts, we're kind of seeing some THC numbers get up in the realm of the very unlikely. Like a friend of mine recently texted me and said that there is a dispensary that had a bud on their menu that was 47% THC, which, I mean, you tell me, does that seem likely?
So, as far as flower, that is a flat, what do you want to call it? Just a lie. That seems highly unlikely. I don't care how great your growing conditions are, but now you're starting to push the limit of what the plants could produce. 47% THC, that would mean THCA would have been at least 13% higher. I mean, now you're just beginning to push the limits of what's possible. And we really do see that a lot. We really do see, I've done some sort of round robin testing with some Menable labs where we've sent some samples out, right? Flower, homogenized flower. And what's been interesting, some of them know about it, some don't. But what's been interesting is all other cannabinoid numbers would line up within 1 to 2%, except THCA. For certain labs would be 10 points higher. I'm talking about I would get 20, they would get 30. Or other labs would get 20, some labs would get 30. So it kind of begs the question, when you're looking at about 10 different cannabinoids and they're all lining up but one, why is lab B all of a sudden 10 points higher on this one compound, but all the other compounds are spot on with everybody else? I mean, that's a clear indication of inflating potency for flower based on that. Of course, those labs will not do it based on an edible Delta 9, knowing that, well, if manufacturer gives you a 10 milligram edible, you're not going to give them back a result of 15 milligrams, right? It doesn't quite work out, or 20 milligrams, but you can on flower. And they build in this unscrupulous work. And this is what we see. Of course, we would lose business because, well, lab B does give them that number. And unfortunately, not much we as labs can really do about it. The onus is really on the state to enforce some of those things from happening.
Yeah, and I have to imagine that a lot of this is based too on the fact that consumers really look to that THC number as the indicator of quality for the cannabis. I'm still waiting for the day when that's not the case, and that consumers will look at aroma or bag appeal or just flavor more so than just a raw THC number.
I totally, you and I both, I think we've beat this thing to death about, hey, it's not just about that THC number as an indicator of quality. I mean, cannabinoids or cannabis, depending on how you're using it, really depends on a myriad of factors. We all talk about entourage effect and whatnot. There's terpenes effects, and there's been talk back when where people were saying, well, this 12% flower from California knocks my socks off, and I get a 30% from Nevada and it doesn't do anything. And it's like, well, yeah, because it's not just about the numbers. It doesn't mean that, the lab in the other state was cheating, but it's not just about that THC number. It's an entourage effect along with your body as well, your receptors and how those behave, how your genetics are playing a factor into it. So yeah, it'd be great on the day when you can really, look more to the science of other compounds, and not even just cannabinoids, but the whole set of compounds in cannabis and how they play with your receptors to really give you, certain relief that you're looking for.
Well, that and not all of us are looking to get our socks knocked off either, right? And when you're buying alcohol, you're not going for Everclear every time. You're going for a nice wine or something like that. So one of these
Exactly.
days, it's going to change
One of
one
these
of
days,
these days. I'm sure.
we can only hope.
But talking about the variation between labs, and we've touched on the fact that some labs might be unscrupulous and kind of inflating numbers. But I was wondering if you could talk about just more natural variations, whether it be like you've touched upon before, that the plant is not homogeneous, and there's going to be some variation in the plant itself. But what about different instruments, different reference standards, different things like that? Could those be causing the variations as well that we're observing?
That's really a good point that you brought up. And yes, so um, when we talk about, an agricultural product that's grown acres and you have lights hitting different parts of it, and your nutrients getting certain parts, or disease hitting certain parts of it, yeah, your cultivar wouldn't necessarily have the same value homogeneously throughout. So there's, yeah, lots of other factors that affect that. Honestly, it starts off in sampling, even how you sample the product, right? When you're sampling for an assay, are you doing it in a statistically significant manner? Are you picking evenly, or are you only picking top nugs versus smaller popcorn? But depending on what you're looking for. And then, yes, you get to the instrument. There is the issue with manufacturer of your certified reference material, right? You have to vet that very well, make sure it's an ISO accredited manufacturer, and make sure, okay, have I done my due diligence and make sure that this compound is at the purity that they say it is, and is it stable enough? Because I've seen situations where we all know once you mix this cannabinoids, even in standards, together, there's some interactions that begin to happen, and there is some breakdown and decarboxylation depending on your storage condition and how many cannabinoids are mixed together. It's unstable, right? So the lab has to do the due diligence and make sure they're storing their standards correctly, they're vetting their vendor correctly, and they're calibrating correctly. Each of these standards come with a certificate of analysis, just like we put out for the public. You have to look at that. What is the purity of my THCA? Does the vendor who did their work and say, hey, we've done the analysis and the purity is really 90%. So if I'm getting a 1000 ppm standard, when you shoot it on your instrument, it's really 900. But as an analyst, am I typing in 1000 into my HPLC? That would be wrong, right? Because the vendor says this is a 1000 ppm standard. However, based on the purity, it's really 900. So technically, you should be typing in 900. So you can see how things start to get funny if even the analyst may not be even unscrupulous about it, may just be ignorant to that fact. They're looking at COAs. These are all things we have to consider that adds to that variability.
Right. And all these things can kind of compound upon each other, right? And kind of create even bigger variances.
They really do. I mean, we talk about methods of measurements of uncertainty. Has every lab really done this? How you pipette has an effect. Was it calibrated? Everything you do adds to your measurement uncertainty. So has all the labs necessarily analyzed for their measurement uncertainty? What is that value? How far away? What is the error that you expect per your result? We've talked about this several different ways. Is that something that should be reported on a COA? Should you report your cannabinoid value as a range rather than a single certified value? Because technically, a range makes more sense and it's probably the most accurate. Now, I get where folks wouldn't want that, right? If I'm selling and I'm reporting, oh, this sample is between 18 to 21%. Well, I guess there are certain folks who are selling it that may not want that, right? But that is the truth. And is that something the state should regulate? I will leave that up to the state to make that decision.
Yeah, smart man. So talking about standardization too, and if the state's going to come out and dictate certain standards, do you think that would potentially stifle innovation that the labs need to do? I know I've listened to panels that you've been on CanMed before, and you've talked about how it never surprises you the different matrices that come through the door, and that each one is sort of is a small science project to be able to fully analyze it. And how would a standardization push like this sort of prevent you from doing that?
Great question. Honestly, you got to talk about what the rules are looking to standardize, right? It depends really on what you're attempting to standardize. Are we talking about homogenization? Are we talking about the prep method, talking about sampling, or the instrument method, right? I think when we talk a lot about this, a lot of folks refer straight to the instrument method, but forget to realize that those other parts play probably a bigger role in the variability that we see. How labs are homogenizing their sample can make a huge difference. Are you picking off kefi material versus are you homogenizing the whole flower? That has to be regulated. And yes, I do believe if we head towards, some of maybe the instrument method, it is going to stifle innovation. You see labs out there as more standards become available. We're getting to analyze more and more cannabinoids. You see COAs with, 20 or more cannabinoids being analyzed for. This gives a consumer more information. I think if you look at SB 544, you got to ask the question, is it referring to the state reference lab adopting a standard test or for all licensed labs being forced to adopt a single method? It's all about interpretation, right? I think the intent of the SB 544 is noble, but if the goal is to stabilize an agricultural product's potency, enforcement is really the way I think they need to head, as rather than try to force labs to use a single method, which would stifle the innovation. Even when you look at a USP, yes, there are compendial methods out there, but it allows also for each individual lab to be able to validate a method per the criteria set forth by the regulating body, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, you can use my method, or if you don't or don't have that instrument, you can use this other instrument, but you'd have to validate following this criteria. And that's where things might be a little bit better and easier if the state went that route, right? Honestly, I think they need to perform more on label round robins with all different cannabinoids to get the labs to align a little better. It should be within a 10% deviation. It shouldn't be as far as what we're seeing now, up to 40% deviation, right? It shouldn't be able to only force labs to analyze a certain subset of compounds. If they do this, will they be forcing you to analyze only THC, CBD, CBDA, CBGA? What exactly will they establish a list of compounds? So again, I'm really anxious to see, how they execute this, how the DCC execute this, and that'll really determine the success of that program.
Yeah. And so would you, not necessarily support, but would you expect that the state would potentially do sort of a proficiency test where they kind of homogenize a big batch and send it out to all the labs and then see if what the variation is between the results?
Most definitely, I would expect that something like NIST has been doing, which we've been participating in for all the rounds where they homogenize one and send it out. But here's the problem: when the state does this, if a lab is doing something unscrupulous, they know this and they know the right way to do it. So magically, the state numbers from all the labs are probably going to align, right?
Right.
So I think the state needs to find a way to do this
or something,
yeah,
right?
It needs to be blinded. It needs to be really blinded. The state needs to find a way to do this, probably through the producers or cultivators or whoever they want to use without the labs knowing. And that will be the true test, right? If they just send in some manufacturer, hey, we're looking to be a new client. Here's my product. We'll quickly find out which labs are, especially if you send them a homogenized product, that'll eliminate the variability or at least reduce the variability. And then you can really see who's boosting numbers.
Absolutely. And now, what do you think about producers and manufacturers having their own in-house testing? Is that something that could sort of help regulate or stifle some of this lab shopping?
Yeah, I've worked with a few producers that do that. And some of the best ones work directly with the lab and say, hey, we're going to develop this relationship. I have an HPLC in house. Um, Here's my method. Let me see your method. Let's get on the same page. And then you begin to analyze together and look at the statistical analysis, the differences in your methodologies, and you come to some sort of consensus in what you're doing. And those folks get, you know, they would do their in-house and they will be directly in line with what is expected because they wouldn't have to necessarily depend on go lab shopping. But there are some considerations when you want to do something like this. You know, for one, you should follow some kind of strict QA/QC procedures with your third-party lab, and it's important that you're aligned with who your CRM vendor is, even some of your consumables, the method. Is it standardized? Even the instrument they're using, you know, the labs have to get preventive maintenance done every so often. I would expect the producer to do the same with their instrument. And even more importantly, qualified personnel to run it. Because again, this is not like just a plug and play. Oh, let me do this. Like you mentioned before, alluded to before. Every day is a little experiment as you get these different matrices in, and you need to have somebody who's qualified who understands what they're dealing with to be able to think on their feet and understand when things go out of whack or really understand the instrument itself. So yes, I think it's a great thing that folks should be doing, but it has to be in line with how the lab tests as well.
Yeah, and that's a good point when you talk about just competency of the lab techs. And you said that there's 40 plus labs in California, and as we know, cannabis is a very complicated matrix with a lot of different compounds and pesticides that have similar molecular weights to the compounds. And not that you need to name any names, but how much of this variation could come down to just either whether it be inexperience or incompetency as well?
That is a very good question, and I don't know if we'll ever find out. I feel like it's complex. However, cheating is easy, right? I think
Right.
folks hire some pretty intelligent folks, and cheating is really easy. Cheating consistently is not easy, right? And that's where you start to weed out those labs. And we've seen all kinds of stories in the headlines of recalls and labs doing this and that. So I think a lot of it, I wouldn't chalk it up to competency. There's a percentage of it. I do chalk it up to direct negligence on either the analyst, the lab ownership management staff. It's intent, right? Of course, it's hard to prove intent, but I think if you look in the right places, you can see that. And that's what unfortunately really bothers me, in that with this competition that's happening is not being regulated in the right way, and we cannot expect the lab to be the regulators. I think the state needs to listen when folks do tell them about potential issues, and they should do the due diligence, and they've done great. I know 43 labs across the state or more, and so many staff in the state to be able to handle this. They've done a great job, doing their own audits and whatnot. But maybe there's some better ways to make it a little bit easier to weed out some of these unscrupulous players. And that's always something. Of course, I'm willing to help if needed. I think we all need to be the beacon in this industry. Like somebody once said, all boats rise in the tide, and California needs to set an example.
Excellent. All right. So winding down here, and forgive me, but I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. So it sounds like, you're in support of standardization and this push here, obviously, probably with some caveats too, like that, there's a certain level that you're willing to go to. So what is that? So say I'm putting you in charge of standardization of labs in California. How would you do it?
Oh, wow. Yeah, you definitely put me on the spot there. I wasn't ready for that one. No, but honestly, how would I do it? I would kind of follow USP's footsteps. You set out some or work, not just USP, but work with AOAC, work with ASTM, with some of those compendial methods out there. Make sure it's modern, first of all. nobody wants to work with a method that is using some ink blood test or whatever. But really look at, okay, if you want to analyze cannabinoids, you can say, give a myriad of detectors you should use, a myriad of instrument types you should use. And I'm talking about, HPLC or LCMS. I'm not talking about manufacturer specific instruments. A column specification, right? Some mobile phases. There are certain parameters I would say this should be followed. And each lab would essentially, you'd have a couple options. You have to be able to replicate the standardized method, and you can have your own innovative method as well, right? So, and those two, based on whatever analytes you're looking at, should match, right? So if I randomly send you a sample and I say run it on, your standardized method and your own innovative method, you should come up with the same results. That's how I would do it. Have the labs sort of maintain a state reference method, and they can, report on their own method based on a validation that meets the criteria that was set forth. So validation is important as well. Set specific criteria and specific ways, reference the FDA or whatever other organization you would like to reference as far as validation parameters, and enforce that. Secondarily, continue having blind round robin sent out randomly throughout the year to make sure that labs are in line. Conduct a more regular audit and audit the different areas of the lab, not just a certain assay or a certain personnel or instrument, but keep it fresh, right? This is how you keep people on their toes. This is how you keep people honest. That's really what I would focus on. And additionally, the potency thing is a huge issue, but I'm more concerned about contaminant levels. Making sure that labs are not putting things out there that could be detrimental to folks' health, right? That's very important. They can play the potency game, but when you start messing around with instrument limit of detection to pass things that perhaps shouldn't be out there for, we always talk about immunocompromised patient, but it's not just about them. It has to be the entire population. Whether I'm immunocompromised or not doesn't mean I want to smoke a product full of chlorphenapyr or imidacloprid, right? Nobody really knows how this affects your body based on the route of administration. So that has to be of utmost importance to the state. And I guess that's what I would really focus on, finding innovative and efficient ways to enforce while enforcing on modes of validation, I think, as opposed to trying to stick a lab to say, only analyzes for cannabinoids by diode array detector. And that'll be the standardization.
Right. All right. Well, you handled the question well, Annie. Very, very good.
Try.
All right. I'm going to let you go. Thanks so much for joining us. And it'll be very interested to see how this all plays out in California. And good luck.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Afia. Check out the links in the show description to learn more about the topics we discussed. And thanks again to our sponsor, Cannabis. We will be back with a new episode on February 2nd, Groundhog Day. That's 2 weeks from today. In the meantime, please do check out all the great resources we have at canmedevents.com. You can view the CanMed 2022 schedule, explore the CanMed archive, listen to previous podcast episodes, and of course sign up for email alerts. If social media is more your thing, you can stay connected with us on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Just search for CanMed Events. And speaking of Facebook, check out our CanMed Community Facebook group. It's a great way to connect with your fellow attendees and presenters in between events. And one last thing, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Doing so really helps the podcast reach more listeners. Okay, that's it from us. Stay safe, Stay healthy, and please join us for the next CanMed Coffee Talk.